Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here. I did not know, but basically I will be delivering the second half of Maria's paper, talk. Our protagonists are the same, our geographies differ a little bit, and the museums that I will talk about are museums, yeah. So they are not exactly contemporary art galleries, but I think the challenges will be more than familiar. So I'd like to start with a caveat. This research I started as a rather spontaneous sort of personal reaction to the full-scale invasion. I have been working with museums and heritage in the last 7 years, and it was an impromptu attempt on my side to start to focus on evacuation, understand what works, what doesn't work, what are the challenges. And first I started interviewing remotely, and then I went to Lviv and Kiev. I spent around 2 months there altogether from between June and August. And in the meantime, I did media analysis. Why I'm flagging this up, this is not a very well-designed representative sample. This is ongoing work, so whatever I'm presenting, I think serves as the sort of outline of what's going on, but it's not exactly as robust as I would like it to be. What I'd like to achieve with this is a sort of broader analysis of this sector, what it means to underfund culture permanently, and what it does in a conflict situation. So with this, I'd like to link back to the panel in the morning. I think culture is infrastructure. Culture is part of the commons. This is part of the state. This is state infrastructure. So I've been analyzing my doctoral work. My background was an analysis of how institutions, cultural institutions, changed since 1991 in Ukraine. And I think, just to recap for what this means for museums, the sector is still dominated by vertical structures. Everything that is a museum object that is owned by the state or communally owned is part of the Museum Fund of Ukraine. So these are state property. Any action around them is carried out by the Ministry of Culture. So if you want to register something as a museum artifact, if you want to move it, if you want to restore it, you need the involvement of the Ministry of Culture. Museums can be national, regional, local. Either way, ultimately, they belong under the Ministry of Culture. University museums belong under the Ministry of Education. Logic is the same. One way for museums to sort of step, not exactly out of this vertical, but to have a different kind of relationship with it, is to seek municipal management. This is something that I documented in Lviv in 2015-16, as soon as local museums started to see that the local municipal leadership is quote-unquote better. I don't want to qualify this now much more. They sought transfer from the vertical state apparatus to directly belong under the city council. The advantages of that is that they would be, the people that they are in touch with are right there. And why I'm stressing this will become clear in a second. But one more point that I'd like to make is that this vertical structure is paired with limited executive function and budgetary autonomy when it comes to directors. So the museum directors, by and large, are not exactly free to do what they want in terms of managing their institutions. They cannot quite change institutional hierarchy, and only a limited part of their budget is something that they can make autonomous decisions about. So salaries are set, everything is pretty much set. There has been decentralization, so the ground is changing, and there have been prestige projects, some sort of not entirely state projects that are run a little bit different, but by and large, this is true for the entire country. So when it happens, when war happens, then what does this mean? One thing that struck me, most of the interviews that I started conducting were with museum directors from the Donbass. Some of them were also with Kharkiv Oblast-based people. What I mean is close to the front line, one way or another, heavily affected by the invasion. What became immediately obvious was that there was no centralized plan. Disaster preparedness was not great. Most museum directors told me that there might have been, not with every single one of them, but there were surveys conducted by the Ministry of Culture in the year prior to invasion, but there was no follow-up to that survey, and there was no consequence of whatever the results of these surveys were. They did not translate into specially allocated funding or policy that would have required museum directors to assess the vulnerability of their collections and to prepare in terms of packaging materials, evacuation plans, bomb shelters. Two, the budget was frozen. So obviously, under war conditions, culture is not the highest priority. With this, I do not mean that it is a high priority peacetime, but basically what we find is that the key basic functions, such as salaries, the management of buildings, was continued. So in that sense, the sector did not collapse, but there was no extra funding to support the logistics of rescuing museum items at all. This is a sector very heavily dominated by women. Because of this, immediately in these initial weeks, there was a very intense conflict between their duties of social reproduction, so taking care of their children, parents, families, and so on, and the professional duty that I describe, or I would frame as the cultural reproduction of the country, right? So to ensure that the collections that they are caring for remain more or less intact. And here I will link back to Maria. Museum directors who would choose to evacuate, and evacuation has to happen quickly when tanks are coming at you, they would have to seek permit from the Ministry of Culture. Without the permit, you don't go through the blog post. Rightly so, right? Because it's impossible to distinguish you from a thief. Because of this, they would need either, so the position, what I refer to as the limited autonomy of the museum director, translates into the museum director's de facto inability to initiate the evacuation of their collections. Even if they did take the individual decision to prepare, then some of them did buy packaging materials, some of them did think about evacuation routes, some of them even had vehicles with which to at least rescue the most precious items of their collections. But this does not always translate into successful evacuation because they end up in this legal gray zone. They have criminal responsibility. If they are driving a car with a bunch of 18th century manuscripts through a blog post, well, good luck. You need Leonid Maruschak. Patterns that I discovered, and again, just a reminder, this might not be the most robust from a sociological perspective, preliminary sort of patterns. Individual strategies of directors, how much initiative they were willing to take and how much risk they were willing to take, had a huge impact on whether they were able to rescue their collections or hide them away or something like that. Most importantly, because of these vertical structures, I found incredible differences between directors who have never had any contact with the Ministry of Culture and those who were on a, talking on the phone on a weekly basis. This obviously translates to some extent, this translates into the quote-unquote importance, the existing hierarchies that are there in the cultural sector. So obviously if you are a sort of remote rajonni muzej, you might have a lesser chance of catching the attention of the ministry in Kyiv. So huge differences. Those people who work for incredibly prestigious organizations, for example, the Kharkiv Literary Museum, the National Museum of immense significance for the Ukrainian national project, were able to evacuate, not only because the director, that was very important, that the director had the foresight, prepared, allocated the budget, all that, but also because of the aforementioned proximity with contacts within the ministry. So she managed to ask for military support, get a bunch of soldiers from the Teroborona, go to the train station, and the manuscripts are out. Manuscripts are safe. And the third factor that I found that really determines whether there is any chance to rescue collections is whether the museum staff has any existing contact with relevant civil society organizations. And I'll get to what kind of organizations I mean in a second. So because in the initial weeks and months, I do not want, so again, caveat, I do not have a robust, proper understanding of what is happening within the ministry. This is partly due to difficulties with access, partly national security issues, so this is just not very easy to understand in real time. I do not want to accuse the ministry of inaction, but what I see from these frontline or near frontline museum directors is that they could not establish contact. The majority of them could not establish contact with the ministry, and even when they did, the procedures there were no procedures designed to fit a wartime reality. There was no bureaucracy light that anybody could switch into in case of an escalation, but the peacetime protocols designed for much slower procedures prevailed. So all sorts of incredibly slow paperwork. That was very difficult to get. Obviously, ministry staff was also hiding at that point. Many of them were also sitting in bomb shelters. So who were the successful people? Successful people, I, again, find two broad categories. One are the civil sector organizations that either have just extensive on-the-ground network and experience in these regions where, to be very honest, my impression is that not too many such initiatives ever reached these regions before the Maidan. Most important initiative I could identify in relation to the Donbass is this museum open for renovation. Maria mentioned the guy who knows his way around the Bullock Post. He's the head of that. They built up, with really slow on-the-ground work, in the course of 2 years, they built up a really robust network of museum staff in the Donbass. He told me in an interview that it took them about 2 years to gain trust. And that there was a general sense of mistrust towards the ministry and towards Kyiv in general. Kyiv is really far. There have been bad experiences, or had been bad experiences, so it took them a really long time to get through this mistrust. Another type of organization that is really efficient are sort of, let's call them civic initiatives that are attached to volunteer battalions in the course of the 14-22 Donbass war. Why? Because they have experience with logistics and they have experience driving into conflict zones, so they would be the kind of people from whom you might get drivers who are willing to drive into Sloviansk and take boxes out. When you get to a point that there is a de facto occupation of a certain place, obviously all the above that I said about criminal responsibility flies out of the window, and at that point it becomes viable and desirable to just evacuate no matter what kind of paperwork you have. So when I was in Lviv, I was watching these guys at this initiative called Lvivski Licer, very close links to Pravi sector, as they were driving their pretty broken minibuses with Polish packaging materials into Donbass to at least hide away some stuff. The other kind of initiative is a more peculiar, I find it, from a sort of sociological, anthropological perspective, I think it's a very, very interesting development, is new initiatives that are led by people who normally work in state museums or municipal departments somewhere in the heritage sector. And they would set up, again, like Maria, they would set up a legal entity. Usually these are charitable funds. And these are much easier to deal with when it comes to receiving foreign aid. So the budget is frozen. There is not, the two kinds of sources that you can get are donations and foreign support. And foreign support is the more reliable, sort of larger scale, more predictable variety of the two. And in order to channel that and successfully channel that to state institutions, so museums, if you're basically both, if you have your NGO but you are also the director of a museum, then you have sort of one foot in each realm. And the Museum Crisis Center and Heritage Rescue Emergency Initiative are the two most prominent examples that I could identify. Olga Gonchar, Leonid Maruschak, Igor Poshivailo, these people. So again, the exact same people that Maria mentioned. What's important, again, to add from a sort of political economy perspective is the funding sources. So the entire cultural sector after Maidan has become very heavily shaped by the presence of transnational cultural funding, whether from the EU or US organizations, British Council, and these are the same institutions that kept these civic initiatives going and thereby basically provided state support in a kind of roundabout way. And the environment within which this unfolds is highly volatile, and I think this is what I'll wrap up with. This is the Ministry of Culture's database of crimes against cultural heritage. Cultural heritage is a systematically targeted sector, so it's part of the war effort. It's very, very often it's not collateral damage, but it is explicitly targeted. This is what you see here. Over 500 cultural institutions, monuments, religious institutions, libraries have been damaged or destroyed. So the work that these people are doing, sort of in a way stepping in, taking on their shoulders some of the work of the state, is something that I think is a vital part of the war effort, and something that they themselves call the cultural front, or often the museum front. I'll wrap up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diána.
Thank you so much.